Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for the organization, for your invitation, and thank you all for being here. Today's lecture is titled, as you can see, Remember You're a Doctor, and that's the English translation of my PhD thesis. Vergeet niet dat je arts bent. So. Unfortunately, we only have a Dutch version now, but hopefully in the future we'll have an English translation. It's been published 3 weeks ago, so it's all a very hectic time in my life. Thank you. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So my PhD thesis is on the topic of the Jewish physicians in the Netherlands during the German occupation. That was from 1940 until 1945, 5 full years from May to May. And this, oh, sorry. Oh yeah, this is a bit different now, but I'll manage. We'll go on to the next slide first, because this is what I wanted to explain to you first, why I chose this title, Remember You're a Doctor. It points out that a large part of my research has been based on oral history. As you can see, this is a quote from the father of this man. This man is Hans Keilson, a Dutch psychiatrist who came to the Netherlands from Germany in the 1930s. And during the German occupation in the Netherlands, he and his father were forced to part, to say goodbye. And on that particular moment, his father pointed out to Hans, "Please, son, remember you're a doctor. That's going to be important for you." And that points out that it's not only the possible privileges he could get out of that, but also the duties that he had being a physician. By the way, the picture has been taken by the photographer Julie Blick that I've been cooperating with, and we also established a photo exhibition with many of my interviewees. Now going back to this slide, because having told what the title means, you can also see what my starting point was. So I wanted, first of all, I had a general interest in the Jewish physicians in the Netherlands and their fates, their moral dilemmas, and their experiences. So I started gathering as much information as I could, but I was particularly interested in that question: what was the meaning of the medical profession? What were the privileges, if there were privileges, and what were the duties, the obligations, and how did the doctors actually live up to those obligations? So what did I start doing? First of all, I needed to find out whom we were actually talking about, because that was not known. So I tried to create a database with names and personal details of the Dutch Jewish physicians. And I found out that there were 534 Dutch physicians, so registered as Dutch physicians, who were later on also registered as Jews, according to the Nazi standards. Of course, there was some secondary literature, not much, as Ross already pointed out. There's not much known about the Jewish physicians. So I needed many primary sources, and of course, first of all, archives, but I specified, or I focused mainly on ego documents. So I gathered lots of diaries and letters to to use the personal voices of these physicians. And I also interviewed nearly 200 people. 7 of them had been doctors back then. As you can understand, they were really, really old, and so that's why I could only find 7 of them. In the meantime, already 5 of them have died. But 12 others were medical students at the time, and the rest of them were relatives, wives, nurses, and all sorts of people that were involved in the stories. As you know, and as Sari already pointed out, oral history does have some downsides. But I think for me, especially as a doctor, it was appealing to use oral history. I don't know whether you know David Rothman's Strangers at the Bedside. He says that doctors have the tendency anyway to write biographies, case history instead of history. That comes more naturally to a doctor, and it's easier than to create the general overview as historians usually do. And I think I shared that tendency. I was interested in those personal stories, so that's why you can already also see that in the result, that it's mainly based on the personal stories. Now I will tell you more about what the outcomes were. I already told you, a database was created with 534 names of Jewish doctors and as many details as I could find. Who were they? I called them in my first chapter ordinary Dutch doctors. And for that, it's good to know a little bit about the Dutch context, which is completely different than the context in Eastern Europe. What you can see in the civilized, bureaucratic Dutch society is that, of course, there was anti-Semitism, but not the form of anti-Semitism that you know in Eastern Europe. So you can tell that in the medical world, the Jewish doctors actually were fully integrated and emancipated. And an example of that is that the chairman of the Dutch Medical Association, so the representative body of the Dutch physicians, had been a Jew 4 times before the war. And also in the academic world, you can see that there's a representation, an accurate representation of the Jewish population in the positions of professors. And also in general, Dutch society, they were fully integrated. They made out 8% of the total number of physicians, which is a large part when you know that only 1.4% of the Dutch population was Jewish. As you can imagine, being fully integrated, there's also a high grade of assimilation, but often with some form of Jewish identity. You can tell that in all these stories there is something that people were aware of their Jewish identity, but that didn't conflict with their medical position and their position in the Dutch medical world and the Dutch society. And an example of that is this man, Herman Pinkhoff, who was Orthodox, but was also a very well-established, well-known Dutch physician. He wrote in the Dutch medical weekly newspaper, and he, for example, also wrote the medical dictionary that we still use until today. And he showed that even in ethical subjects, the combination of being an Orthodox Jew and a well-established Dutch physician was not problematic. And the reason for that is that I found that Jewish and general medical ethics at the time in the Netherlands overlapped. You can call that the Neoromantic tradition that they were educated in. And to explain a little bit what that means, you could call the doctors back then gentlemen physicians. They felt that it was not simply a job, but it had been a calling, and they should act according to that. So, for example, the guide Medical Ethics that was written in 1936 in the Netherlands started with apologizing that such a guide was written anyway in the first place, because one could assume that a doctor had an inborn feeling of morality and was a good man already because he had chosen this profession. But they said it was useful for young doctors to know what was customary among the older ones. So that's why they did publish the guide. If you look at the origins for that Neo-Romantic tradition, you can, of course, go to the Hippocratic Oath, but also Maimonides' morning prayer for the physician was very well known at the time in the whole Dutch medical world, also among non-Jewish doctors. And the ideal, I have called that in my PhD, the paternalistic altruism. That was their moral compass. They had the feeling, and I'll quote one of the Jewish physicians. He held a radio speech for school children, and he said, "In this profession, more than in any other, it is known that when the individual with a calling stands before a patient who expects help, he mustn't forget that it is not sufficient to know his knowledge, but first and foremost his humanity and compassion as a strong figure who can take the sorrow away." That was what they started out with. But of course, meanwhile, in Germany, there were already situations of what you could call perverted paternalism. Paternalism after the war has a negative connotation because it can also, in extreme forms, lead to dehumanizing patients and overruling the interests of the patients for the benefit, so-called benefit of the state, as was done in the Third Reich. At the time, Dutch physicians, Jewish and non-Jewish, cooperated in their protest against what was happening at the eastern neighbors. But, as you know, the Netherlands was also occupied in May 1940. And that changed everything dramatically. And already, after 4 days of the occupation, 11 Jewish physicians had committed suicide, already abandoning, actually, everything and every moral standard that they had acted in accordance with beforehand. This was unbelievable. But, of course, the vast majority, the others, of those 534 doctors did try to go on as normally as possible. But very soon they did notice drastic changes. Although it seemed as if the Germans acted civilized in the Netherlands, that was of course appeared to be false, since they acted in a very organized manner. That was their tactic in the context of the Netherlands. Okay, so they were very soon already isolated, which is very painful if you know that they were in such a collegial environment as integrated part of the Dutch physicians. So they were soon isolated and working in a Jewish state in a state, you could call it. So they were already, within 1 year of occupation, they were already degraded, isolated, and lost a lot of their status, although they could continue to work for Jewish patients. But being a doctor was not what it used to be anymore. And in their isolation, at first it looked as if their medical work remained normal, but that changed in the beginning of 1942, when doctors were ordered to start performing medical examinations for Jewish men who were about to be sent to the labor camps in the north and east of the Netherlands. And this is what happened then. This is what I call the start of medical sabotage, medical resistance. And if you read it, you probably understand why. These doctors were faced with a dilemma. Should I cooperate with this? And if yes, how do I do that? And they found out that they could actually use their medical means to resist this and to make people as sick as possible, to try and prevent them from being sent to these labor camps. And that continued when the deportations actually started in July 1942. And the deportations have often been compared to a shipwreck, people looking for small boats to be safe on, lifeboats. And I think medicine showed that medicine could actually be a lifeboat, temporary. So all sorts of, all forms of medical sabotage appeared. So false hospitalizations, false medical declarations, which is of course under peace circumstances unthinkable. So I have to continue really fast, but I'm nearly through. But you can see that of course creates dilemmas during those deportations, because how far can you actually go in bending your medical ethics in favor of a higher goal? Can you actually cut in healthy bodies to make people too sick for deportation, or does that go too far? How about euthanasia cases, abortions? We've talked about it previously. And how far does the obligation towards your patients reach? Do you have to stay with them when you're in danger yourself? And again, the shipwreck metaphor is useful for that. This is an example of a Dutch Jewish physician that actually stayed with his patients in the Dutch Jewish psychiatric hospital. He knew it would be raided, but he stayed until the bitter end. And I think that's because of his moral compass as a paternalistic, altruistic doctor, old-fashioned doctor. And even in the camps, my last chapter is on the transit camp of Westerbork, so I didn't go outside the country's borders. But you can see that even in Westerbork, there was a possibility for the doctors to build up a hospital, a really well-functioning hospital, and to do medical work there, to stay longer themselves, but on the other hand also help others. And then you can see, which is of course also in the same line as what Ross told us, that also in my cohort you can see that these doctors had a much higher survival chance. Out of my group of 534 doctors, only 253 were deported, whereas, as you might know, 75% of the Dutch Jews were deported, and 86 of the deported physicians survived, whereas only 1 in 22 other Dutch deportees survived. So they had a lot higher survival chance. So you could conclude that being a doctor did mean a lot, and not only in the survival rates, but also in taking care of others, of patients. That paternalistic altruism definitely played a role. Not, of course, you cannot understand that there were situations in which everything lost its meaning, but there were many more situations in which it did play a role, even in the extermination camps. But sometimes a new set of rules appear to be applicable. And then I think for my generation and for future generation physicians, maybe it is inspiring to remember that attitude, that moral compass, that, as I've called it, paternalistic altruism that these doctors had. And that's my conclusion for today. Hopefully in time.